Hello and welcome back to the Advanced English Podcast. If you're a C1 or C2 learner looking to bridge the gap between effortful textbook speech and true native fluency, you are in the right place. I'm Hayley, and today this episode is based on one of my favourite books, The Language Instinct, by the brilliant cognitive scientist and linguistics professor Steven Pinker. But before we get the ball rolling, a quick reminder for you, if you want to truly master all of the phrasal verbs, idioms and expressions we're using today, make sure to click the link in the description to download the full transcript. Even better, you can head straight over to our brand new vocabulary and grammar platform where you can interactively practice, test and consolidate all of the advanced terms from this episode so that they actually stick in your long-term memory. Right, let's get stuck in then, shall we? So today we're going to take a look at a few chapters from the book. The first is chapter 2. So this chapter is a goldmine for language learners because it completely shatters how most people think about speech, grammar and fluency. So if you've ever felt overwhelmed by learning English, or you felt like you're just not smart enough to master a second language, hold that thought, because Steven Pinker's insights are about to give you a massive confidence boost. So the absolute core argument of this chapter is that language is universal and it's deeply instinctive. So Pinker points out that whenever you find a group of humans anywhere on Earth, they are exchanging words. But there is no such thing as a primitive language. Society loves to look down on certain dialects or uneducated communities, assuming their speech is structurally inferior or simplistic. But linguists have proven that whether you're talking to a Silicon Valley executive or a hunter-gatherer tribe in the remote highlands of New Guinea, the underlying grammatical complexity is identical. So every human language utilizes an incredibly sophisticated automated structural system. And to back this up, Pinker shares some fascinating anthropological history. So think about periods of the Atlantic slave trade or indentured servitude in the South Pacific. Plantation owners deliberately mixed laborers from completely different language backgrounds so that they couldn't organize or rebel. And these people were forced to work together, but they didn't share a single word in common. So to communicate, they had to quickly patch together this makeshift jargon that we call pidgin. Now, a pidgin language is a very choppy string of words with virtually no consistent grammar. It's transactional and it's basic. And if you've ever felt like you're just throwing random English words together without knowing the rules, then you were essentially speaking a pidgin. But here is where the science gets completely mind-blowing. What happens when a generation of children is born into that community and grows up hearing only broken pidgin? You might think these kids would grow up speaking broken, ungrammatical gibberish, right? But absolutely not. Pinker highlights the research of a linguist called Derek Bickerton, showing that children's brains instinctively injected grammatical complexity where none existed before. So in a single generation, without a single formal school lesson or a textbook, those children transformed a fragmented pidgin language into a brand new, richly expressive language with rigid, complex rules of syntax. And this is what linguists call a creole. So this tells us that the human brain is like a lexical vacuum cleaner and a grammatical genius. Children don't patiently copy their parents. Their minds are biologically hardwired to create structured language. And if you think this only applies to spoken speech, Pinker throws another spectacular example at us: sign language. So for a long time, people assumed sign language was just a collection of crude gestures or a form of visual pantomime almost. But cognitive scientists have revealed that sign languages, like American Sign Language or ASL, possess rules of agreement, syntax, and morphology that are every bit as intricate as spoken English or French. And in the 1980s in Nicaragua, the government brought together hundreds of deaf children for the first time in a new school. And these kids had grown up isolated, using only basic home signs with their family. And when they were put together in the playground, they didn't have a shared language. So initially they cobbled together a crude gestural pidgin. But within a few years, the younger children took those messy visual signs and instinctively systemized them, creating a completely unique, fully grammatical language known as Idioma de Signos Nicaraguense, or Nicaraguan Sign Language. So their brains literally demanded grammar, and when they couldn't find it in the environment, they built it from scratch. So what does all of this science actually mean for you as an adult language learner? First of all, it means you need to stop beating yourself up over mistakes. So when you're learning English and you accidentally stretch a rule, saying something like, he goed instead of he went, you aren't proving that you're bad at languages. In fact, Pinker notes that 3-year-old native English children make the exact same errors all the time. So they say bees and gots and do's because their inner language instinct has successfully identified a rule and is trying to apply it logically. So most of the errors language learners make would actually be completely grammatical in other world languages. Your brain is just trying to find its feet with a new structural system, basically. Secondly, it proves that language is an active, living verb. It's not a passive noun to be memorized out of a dusty book. Your mind is already biologically hardwired to look for patterns and to build hierarchical structures and to seek social anchorage through communication. You don't need to force yourself to learn how to think logically. Your brain's already doing the heavy lifting behind the scenes. So the trick as an adult is to move well beyond the fear of judgment and tap back into that primal, childlike drive to communicate. And when you immerse yourself in ambient speech, your automated language module begins to sort the sounds directly, tuning your mental parsing systems to deliver the correct structures. So grammar isn't a set of arbitrary, painful rules invented by school teachers to make your life a misery. It is a beautiful biological map built into the very architecture of human nature. So that brings us beautifully out of the playground of universal grammar and lands us straight onto a question that I guarantee every single person listening to this has asked themselves at some point. Do we actually think in words? So if you're an advanced language learner, this is just like the holy grail of fluency, right? You're constantly told by teachers, you need to stop translating in your head and start thinking in English. But in chapter 3 of The Language Instinct, which he entitles Mentalese, Steven Pinker completely turns this idea on his head. He argues that human beings don't actually think in English or Spanish or Japanese or Swahili at all. Instead, our brains have their own secret, unspoken operating system, a pre-verbal language of thought that cognitive scientists call Mentalese. Now, on the surface, this sounds absolutely wild, because when you close your eyes and listen to your inner monologue about what you want for dinner, it definitely feels like you're talking to yourself in a specific language. And for decades, a massive theory called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis completely dominated popular culture. And this theory basically claimed that language determines thought. That if you don't have a word for a specific concept in your native language, your brain physically cannot comprehend it. And it's an idea that a lot of people still buy into today. You see like viral articles all the time listing untranslatable words like the German word Schadenfreude, which means a feeling of joy at someone else's misfortune, and claiming that foreigners experience that world in a completely different psychological reality. But Pinker absolutely wipes out this theory, showing that it is a complete linguistic trap. He points out that if thought were completely identical to language, we would never find ourselves struggling to find the right word. Have you ever had that really frustrating experience where you know exactly what you want to say, it's right on the tip of your tongue, but you just can't find the right vocabulary to express it? Well, if we thought entirely in words, that phenomenon would be physically impossible. The very fact that you can look at a poorly phrased sentence and say, no, that's not what I meant, proves that your underlying thought exists independently of the words that you use to wrap it in. And to really drive this point home, Pinker highlights how brains consistently use visual imagery abstract concepts, and mental mapping without a single syllable attached. Think about trying to pack a car boot or fit furniture into a small room. Your brain is rapidly rotating shapes, calculating spaces, solving physical problems in real time, but it isn't running a linear commentary in English to get the job done. Animals and pre-verbal infants can solve incredibly complex logical puzzles, they can navigate environments, and they show high levels of intelligence despite not possessing a single spoken word. So their brains are running on pure Mentalese. So why does spoken language exist then? Pinker explains that spoken language is simply a vehicle, like a translation mechanism. So your brain uses its internal Mentalese to form an incredibly rich, multidimensional web of thoughts and ideas, but because humans aren't telepathic, we can't just beam those thoughts directly into someone's head. We have to use our vocal cords to encode that rich web into a linear, one-dimensional stream of sound waves. And then the listener hears those sounds and has to rapidly reverse engineer that stream back into abstract Mentalese concepts. So language is the packaging, Mentalese is the actual product. And this brings up a massive, spectacular breakthrough for you as a language learner. If you are struggling with your fluency, or if you feel like you're playing second fiddle to native speakers because your vocabulary is limited, you need to understand that your intelligence is not broken. When you have a fluency block, it isn't a problem with your thinking. It's just a temporary bottleneck in the packaging department, basically. Your brain has already perfectly formed the complex thought in Mentalese, but your English translation module is just taking a bit longer to find the right linguistic boxes to ship it in. Understanding this completely changes how you should approach fluency. Instead of obsessing over memorizing exact dictionary definitions and trying to force your brain to magically think in English out the gate, you need to focus on building immediate automated pathways between your internal Mentalese concepts and spoken words. So when a native speaker talks, they aren't slowly decoding a grammar textbook in their head. They're just letting the sound waves automatically trigger abstract concepts in their mind. And spoken language is a wonderful tool, but it is deeply flawed. Words are riddled with ambiguity, double meanings, phonetic overlap, whereas your internal thoughts are completely precise. So the next time you find yourself stuck for words, just take a moment and relax and remember that your brain's already running a highly sophisticated internal monologue behind the scenes. But this leads us straight into a massive mechanical question. How does your brain take that messy, linear stream of spoken words and successfully untangle it back into a perfect mental blueprint? How does the packaging department actually operate? Well, to unpick that mystery, we need to move straight into the engineering room of human speech, or chapter 4 from the book, which is How Language Works. So this is where we're going to get into the absolute mechanics of syntax and grammar. If you're learning English as a second language, grammar is usually the thing that makes you want to throw in the towel. It feels like this endless, arbitrary list of rules and tenses and irregular exceptions that you have to painfully memorize. But Pinker completely flips the script here. He argues that grammar isn't some terrible invention by linguists to make you miserable. He explains that it is an automated software program, basically, that's hardwired into human nature. And to explain this, he introduces the legendary linguist Noam Chomsky's concept of discrete combinatorial system. Now that sounds very academic and heavy, but the actual concept's pretty simple. So it just means that language takes a strict, finite set of words and uses a specific mental blueprint to combine them into an absolute infinite variety of sentences. So think of it like a linguistic Lego set. So you have a fixed number of blocks, but you can build a spaceship or a castle or the Eiffel Tower, whatever you want. So because of this mental blueprint, you can easily understand a sentence that has literally never been spoken before in the history of the universe. For example, if I say, The purple giraffe drank a pint of warm Guinness while riding a skateboard down Oxford Street. Your brain instantly constructs that exact image in your mind. You didn't have to pause, look up a rule, slowly decode it. Your mental software processed it instantly. But how does the brain actually do that? So Pinker reveals that our minds do not look at language as a flat, linear string of words that are glued together. If computers try to read language like that, they completely hit a brick wall because they get tripped up by ambiguity. Instead, the human language instinct naturally organizes words into a hidden, hierarchical structure known as a phrase-structured tree. So your brain takes a linear stream of sound and instantly groups those sounds into mental branches, like noun phrases, verb phrases, prepositional phrases, and it tracks how these branches connect to one another over huge distances in a sentence. So think about how this affects you when you're practicing your English and you're listening or you're speaking. Have you ever noticed how native speakers can string together a massive, complex sentence, insert a huge parenthesis in the middle, and still magically land the verb perfectly at the end? For instance, in a sentence like, the book that I bought from the tiny cramped antique shop in Edinburgh last year is fantastic. The subject is the book, and the verb is. They're separated by 14 words. And if your brain were just processing words in a simple linear chain, it would get completely lost in the middle of the sentence. But because your language instinct automatically builds a phrase-structured tree, it holds the subject branch open in your working memory, waiting patiently to clip the verb onto it whenever it finally arrives. So this explains why children can pick up their native language so effortlessly without ever opening a textbook. They aren't memorizing specific sentences, they're absorbing these structural blueprints. And Pinker notes that by the time a child is 3 or 4 years old, they are already master engineers of these phrase-structured trees. They instinctively know that you can substitute a whole block of words from a single pronoun. They can take a complex idea like the big scary dog that lives next door and seamlessly swap it out for it, because their brain understands the hierarchical boundaries of a noun phrase. And for you as an advanced learner, this is a game changer. It means that true fluency isn't about memorizing thousands of individual isolated sentences like a parrot. It's about training your brain to become completely comfortable with the underlying architecture of the language. So when you focus too heavily on single words, you're missing the forest for the trees. You want to start noticing the chunks and the branches. And when you read or listen to English, try to see how those sentences are built out of these modular units. Once you train your ear to recognize the phrase structure boundaries, your speaking will naturally become more fluid. So you'll stop hesitating between individual words because your brain will start shipping out entire prefabricated branches of the phrase tree all at once. It really puts a completely different spin on grammar, doesn't it? It isn't a prison of restrictive rules. It is the exact launchpad that gives you the freedom to express anything you could possibly think of. And then this brings us to another layer of the machine. So once you have this architectural blueprint for grammar, you still need the actual raw materials to fill it. You need the individual blocks of your Lego set. And to see how our minds manage this chaotic warehouse of vocabulary, we're going to go straight into chapter 5, which is words, words, words. So we're going to look at the secrets of morphology, how your mental dictionary actually indexes terms, and why regular and irregular verbs handle things completely differently inside your brain. So if you are a C1 or C2 level English learner, this is where the rubber really meets the road. Think about your own language journey for a second. When you first started out, you probably had a tiny bilingual dictionary manually matching English words to your native tongue. But as you progress to an advanced level, you realize quickly that words are not just simple static labels stuck on objects. Words are living, breathing pieces of biological data, and your mind handles them in a way that's completely different from how computer file systems operate. So Pinker starts this chapter by highlighting just how mind-bogglingly efficient the human brain is at absorbing vocabulary. He calls children lexical vacuum cleaners. So research shows that from the minute a child hits their first birthday, They absorb, on average, one new word every 90 waking minutes. So by the time they graduate from high school, the average native speaker has a mental lexicon of about 60,000 words. But here's the trick that Pinker unpicks. How does your brain actually index and store this massive warehouse of words? It doesn't just store words as individual isolated items. Instead, your mind relies on morphology, which is the internal rules of word construction. So your brain looks at a word and instantly breaks it down into constituent components, like the root, prefixes, suffixes. For example, if you hear a completely new made-up word like unbiohackable, your language instinct doesn't panic. It instantly isolates the root, hack, recognizes the biological prefix, bio, slips the potentiality suffix onto the back, able, and then wraps the whole thing in a negative boundary, unbiohackable. So your mind actively builds and decodes words on an assembly line using morphological rules, rather than just pulling static definitions out of a mental filing cabinet. But Pinker reveals that this assembly line inside our heads actually runs on two completely separate parallel tracks. And this is where language learners frequently get caught out. It comes down to the battle between regular and irregular forms. So think about how English handles the past tense. For regular verbs, the rule's dead simple. You take the root verb and you slap ed onto the end. Walk becomes walked, talk becomes talked, biohack becomes biohacked. Pinker explains that this is handled by an automated rule-based module in the brain, so it's an algorithmic operation. So when you use a regular verb, your brain isn't looking up a memory, it's just running a calculation. But what about irregular verbs? What happens when you have to say the past tense of go, or see, or run? You can't say goed, or seed, or runned. The system completely breaks down. Instead, you have to say went, saw, or ran. And Pinker reveals that irregular verbs are handled by an entirely different psychological system, the associative memory network. So your brain doesn't calculate an irregular verb, it retrieves it as a unique historical artifact stored in a specific memory slot. It's a completely different mental mechanism. This explains a classic phenomenon that every single language learner has experienced, the irregular slip-up. Have you ever noticed that when you're tired, or you're stressed, or you're speaking very quickly, you suddenly start making childish mistakes that you thought you'd grown out of years ago? So you might accidentally say something like, I taked the train, or she bringed her homework. And when that happens, you feel really embarrassed and you think your fluency's slipping. But cognitive science shows that your language instinct is actually working perfectly. What has happened is that your associative memory module was temporarily fatigued or blocked, so it failed to retrieve the historical word took or brought in time. And because the memory slot was empty, your automated rule-based module immediately stepped in to fill the void and logically applied the standard ED rule to the root. It's a sign of highly logical, functioning linguistic brain, not a lack of intelligence. So this dual-track system also solves one of the funniest linguistic mysteries that trips people up all the time. Pinker asks, why do we say that the plural of the electronic device Walkman is Walkmans rather than Walkmen? Because after all, the plural of man is men. Well, Pinker explains that it comes down to how the word is structurally filed in your head. So because a Walkman is a type of audio player, not a literal human male, your brain flags the entire word as a brand new rootless compound noun. And because it's flagged as a new compound, the associative memory connection to the irregular plural men is completely severed. So the brain has no choice but to route the word through the standard rule-based plural system, automatically appending an S to the very end. So for you as an advanced learner, understanding this dual mechanism module is a revelation, really. It means you need to treat regular patterns and irregular exceptions with completely different study strategies. You cannot calculate your way through irregular phrasal verbs, idioms, or collocations. You need to feed them directly into your associative memory network through continuous exposure, context, and repetition until that retrieval pathway becomes completely instantaneous. And it really shows that your mental dictionary is an absolute marvel of cognitive engineering. It balances the rigid efficiency of mathematical computing with the fluid flexibility of human memory. But this leads us directly into the final puzzle of language. Once we understand how our brains build sentences with phrase structure trees and fills them with morphological blocks, we have to look at the wider world and ask, why are there so many different languages? If we all share the exact same underlying biological language instinct, why does English sound completely incompatible with Japanese or Swahili or Arabic? Well, to unpick this mystery, we're going to move straight into our final segment of today, which is Chapter 8, The Tower of Babel. So think about it. If Noam Chomsky and Steven Pinker are right, if we all truly share the same exact underlying biological language instinct that's hardwired into our DNA, then why on earth is the world such a chaotic linguistic mess? Why does English sound completely incompatible with Japanese? Why does Spanish look like a totally different species of thought compared to Arabic? If the blueprint is universal, why didn't we all just end up speaking one single universal language? Why did we inherit this ancient curse of the Tower of Babel? Well, Pinker tackles this head on, and his answer is an absolute revelation for anyone trying to master a foreign language. He argues that the staggering diversity of human speech is actually an illusion. On the surface, language looks incredibly fractured and distinct. But when you strip away the top layers, you discover that every single language on Earth is secretly just a minor variation on the exact same underlying biological theme. So to explain how this works, Pinker looks at a language through the lens of evolutionary biology. He points out that language is a living, breathing entity that constantly mutates over time. And whenever a group of humans becomes geographically or socially isolated from another group, their speech automatically begins to drift. It's like a game of Chinese whispers played across centuries, basically. So think about how English itself has evolved. If you try to read Old English from 1,000 years ago, it looks like a foreign Germanic language. As groups of people migrated, they crossed oceans, they've gone over mountain ranges, tiny phonetic slip-ups or slang words and structural shortcuts slowly accumulated. And over 1,000 years, a dialect becomes a distinct language. Over 5,000 years, it becomes completely unrecognizable from its parent tongue. This is how the great language families of the world, like Indo-European, Afro-Asiatic, and Sino-Tibetan, were born. They're all just historical branches of older ancestral dialects that drifted apart. But here is where Noam Chomsky's theory of universal grammar comes back into play to save the day. So Pinker explains that while languages drift, they can never drift completely off the rails. They're tightly constrained by the physical and architectural boundaries of the human brain. The language instinct sets a strict list of parameters like a master control board with a fixed set of switches. And every language on Earth must choose how to flip those switches, but no language can invent a brand new switch out of thin air. For example, let's look at one of the most fundamental switches in syntax, word order. So linguists have discovered that when it comes to positioning the subject, the verb, and the object in a standard sentence, the vast majority of human languages buy into one or two main configurations. They're either head initial or head final. English is a classic head initial language. We place the crucial head of the phrase at the beginning and let the rest of the information trail behind. So we say, the dog chased the cat, subject, verb, object. But if you look at a language like Japanese, the switch is flipped completely in the opposite direction. It is a head final language. So in Japanese, the verb is systematically held back until the very end of the sentence. A literal translation would sound something like, the dog the cat chased. Now on the surface that looks like an irreconcilable difference that makes Japanese completely alien to an English speaker, but Pinker points out that the underlying mathematical logic is identical. Both languages are using the exact same phrase structure trees that we unpicked in Chapter 4. They're both holding the exact same structural components in the working memory. They've just simply decided to mirror the linear sequence of how those components are shipped out of the mouth. So again, this is another game changer for your confidence as a C1 or C2 level learner. It means that when you're struggling to adapt to a new language structure, you aren't trying to learn a completely alien way of thinking. You don't have to re-engineer your brain. Your mind already fundamentally understands the abstract grammatical concepts of subject, verb and object, tenses, modifications, because they're part of your universal grammar toolkit. And all you are doing when you study a foreign language is learning where the specific culture has decided to flip those universal switches. So once you realize that global languages are just superficial variations of a singular human blueprint, the intimidation completely melts away. So you stop viewing English as this hostile, arbitrary fortress of rules that you're locked out of, and you can start seeing it as a familiar house that's just happens to have the furniture arranged in a slightly different layout than your native tongue. And that brings us to the very end of today's episode of the Advanced English Podcast. I truly hope that this look into cognitive science has given you plenty of food for thought, and more importantly, a fantastic range of high-level vocabulary, phrasal verbs, and idioms to help you comfortably ace your upcoming C1 and C2 exams. If you want to ensure that none of these advanced words get forgotten about, make sure to click the link in the description right now to get your hands on the full transcript of today's conversation, or even better, make sure to head straight over to our brand new interactive vocabulary and grammar platform via the link in the description. Over on the platform, you can actively practice, test, and master all the advanced expressions, collocations, and phrasal verbs that we used today so that they can genuinely stick in your long-term memory. And if you found this lesson helpful and you want to help our learning community grow, please do spread the love, give us a thumbs up, share this episode with a fellow English learner, and hit that subscribe button so you always know the exact second another episode drops. Before I officially call it a day, I do have a little challenge for you down in the comments section. Head down there and tell me, do you agree with Pinker that we think in pre-verbal language like Mentalese, or do you genuinely feel that your thoughts change depending on whether you're using your native language or English? I absolutely love reading your insights and getting to know your stories, so don't be shy. Thank you for tuning in, for sticking with me through the syntax trees and the evolutionary history, and for being such a wonderful part of this learning community. Until next time, keep digging into the details, stay curious, and most importantly, keep on top of your advanced English journey. I'll catch you in the next one. Cheers for now. Bye.